Hello and welcome to this short lecture on the Civil Rights era. Please note the years 1954 through 1965. This is a short overview and we won't be talking about everything. We're going to start with Brown versus the Board of Education, which I addressed in detail in the last lecture, and end with the Voting Rights Act of 1965. Brown versus the Board of Education is the decision that's issued in 1954, which declares school segregation, de jure school segregation, which means enforced by law, to be against the Constitution. The court ruled that segregated schools were, quote unquote, inherently unequal, which means that people would understand, children would understand why they are being segregated in some way, and that stamp of inferiority would be impossible to get rid of unless the schools were integrated. That being said, it would take decades upon decades before many school districts were actually integrated in fidelity. So, in 1955, we turn our attention to Montgomery, Alabama, a city where there was still an ordinance wherein African Americans were required to sit in the back half of the bus and yield their seats to white riders if the front half of the bus, reserved for whites, was full. This is a story most of you probably know, because on December the 1st, 1955, an African American woman, a seamstress by the name of Rosa Parks, was commuting home on Montgomery's Cleveland Avenue bus from her job at a local department store. She was seated in the front row of the quote unquote colored section. When the white seats filled up, the driver, J. Fred Blake, asked her and three other passengers to vacate their seats for white paying customers. The other three black riders complied, but Rosa Parks refused. What you may not know about Rosa Parks is that this was a planned and intentional act. Rosa Parks had been previously working with the NAACP for years, one of the organizations that is committed to securing equal civil rights for African Americans. They chose her for this position because she seemed like the perfect plaintiff in a test case wherein they could try to force the Montgomery bus system to integrate through a boycott. As a result of Rosa Parks' arrest, and she was arrested, as you see her being fingerprinted there on the screen, the African American population throughout Montgomery started a boycott of the bus system until it was integrated. As news of the boycott spread, African American leaders across Montgomery, which is the capital city of Alabama, began lending their support. Black ministers announced the boycott in church on Sunday, December 4th, and the Montgomery Advertiser, a newspaper, published a front page article on the planned boycotts. This was all very much a planned circumstance from beginning to end. Approximately 40,000 black bus riders, the majority, by the way, of the city's bus riders in general, boycotted the system starting that next day, Monday, December 5th, 1955. That afternoon, black leaders met to form the Montgomery Improvement Association, or MIA, as it's otherwise known. Critically, this group elected a 26-year-old pastor from Montgomery's Dexter Avenue Baptist Church as its president. His name is Martin Luther King Jr., and they decided to continue the boycott until the city met their demands of integrating the bus system completely and removing the burden of having black customers have to give up their seats if the white section was full. On June the 5th, 1956, a Montgomery federal court ruled that any law requiring racially segregated seating on buses was, in fact, a violation of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. You'll recall the 14th Amendment was one of the Reconstruction Amendments adopted in 1968 following the United States Civil War, which guaranteed all of its citizens, regardless of race, equal protection and equal rights under state and federal laws. The city of Montgomery appealed the loss in court to the United States Supreme Court, which ultimately upheld the lower court's decision on December 20th, 1956. Montgomery's buses were integrated on December the 21st, the next day, 1956, and the boycott ended. All in all, it lasted 381 days. The boycott also saw the birth of one of the most important civil rights organizations led by Martin Luther King Jr. This is the Southern Conference Leadership Coalition, SCLC for short. It will be involved in a number of different civil rights protests, boycotts, and activities, and devoted itself to trying to get equal rights for African Americans. The next thing that I want to talk about is the Greensboro Sit-In. The Greensboro Sit-In was a civil rights protest that started in 1960 when young African American students staged a sit-in at Woolworth's lunch counter in Greensboro, North Carolina, and refused to leave after being denied service because the counter was for whites only. So again, this was a pre-planned protest, and their goal was using nonviolent means to try to bring down another aspect of the Jim Crow segregated South. The sit-in movement soon began to spread to college towns throughout the South. Though many protesters were arrested for trespassing, disorderly conduct, or disturbing their peace, their actions made an immediate and lasting impact, and they were successful in forcing Woolworths and other establishments to change their segregationist policies. That leads me to the Freedom Rides. The Freedom Rides tried to test a decision in 1960 by the Supreme Court called Boynton versus Virginia. The Freedom Rides began the next year in 1961. They wanted to see if the states were actually going to follow that decision. The decision issued declared that segregation of interstate transportation facilities, including bus terminals, was unconstitutional. Remember, the Constitution specifically gives the United States Congress the ability to regulate commerce between the states, what is called with an E, state transportation. So the court ruled that if it was an interstate facility, like a bus terminal, a train depot, anything like that, then you couldn't have state segregation because it was up to the United States Congress to make that decision, and the United States Congress had not declared segregation to be legal. The original group of Freedom Riders who were going to ride throughout the South on Greyhound buses to try to see if they could go into different bus facilities that were supposed to be segregated. This group was 13 people, 7 African Americans, and 6 white individuals. They left Washington, D.C. on a Greyhound bus on May the 4th, 1961. Their goal was to reach New Orleans, Louisiana on May the 17th. It was actually intended to commemorate the 7th anniversary of the Supreme Court's decision in Brown versus the Board of Education. The group traveled through Virginia and North Carolina without really drawing any major public notice. But then, as soon as the buses crossed into South Carolina on May the 12th, things dramatically changed. There, an African American student and member of the SNCC, or SNCC as it's usually called, which stands for Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee. He was actually a white freedom rider and World War II veteran named Albert Bigelow, and another black rider were both viciously attacked as they attempted to enter a whites-only waiting area. On May the 14th, 1961, the Greyhound bus continued and arrived in Alabama. There, essentially on the border of the state, an angry mob of about 200 white people surrounded the bus, causing the driver to continue on past the bus station without stopping. That didn't solve the problem, because the mob got in their cars and followed the bus. The bus tires were blown out and someone threw a bomb onto the bus. The Freedom Riders escaped as the bus burst into flames. You can see it there on the screen, only to be brutally beaten by members of the surrounding mob. What happens, though, is the incident and the images and the testimonials of the people who went on the Freedom Riders hit the newspapers. And that starts to change public opinion. Photographs of the burning Greyhound bus and the bloodied riders appeared on the front pages of newspapers throughout the country and the world the next day, drawing international attention to the Freedom Riders' cause and the state of race relations in the United States. This ultimately forced then President John F. Kennedy to call in federal marshals to protect the riders. The rides continued over the next several months, and in the fall of 1961, under pressure from the Kennedy administration, the Interstate Commerce Commission issued prohibitions against segregating any of the bus depots. So essentially, under severe pressure, and this probably wouldn't have happened had the Freedom Riders not done this, the Kennedy administration was forced to step in and use the muscle of the federal government to ensure that interstate busing was desegregated. The next incident that I want to talk about is probably the one that you know about. This is the March on Washington. Martin Luther King and different labor leaders planned a March on Washington for jobs and to highlight continued racial violence in the South in 1963. President Kennedy was initially opposed to it because he thought that it might turn violent, but he ultimately did endorse the march. The March on Washington was a massive protest march that occurred in August 1963. 250,000 people gathered in front of the Lincoln Memorial in Washington, D.C., also known as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. The event aimed to draw attention to continuing challenges and inequalities faced by African Americans a century after emancipation. But what you probably remember it for is this is where Martin Luther King Jr. delivers his iconic "I Have a Dream" speech. Moving on, I want to talk about the Birmingham bombing. So, all of these civil rights movement were not without their casualties. In many of the southern states, including Alabama, where this took place, there's a series of violent reactions to African Americans pushing for their rights. One of the worst was the Birmingham bombing, which took place on September the 15th, 1963. On that day, a bomb exploded at the 16th Street Baptist Church, which is an African American church, just as the members prepared for their Sunday services. It was a racially motivated attack that ended up killing 4 young girls, whose images are on the screen, and shocked the nation. It was another black eye for the United States as it continued to deal with the racial unrest throughout the South. Finally, though, it does lead to some federal action. For decades after Reconstruction, the United States Congress was unable to pass a single civil rights act. Finally, in 1957, it established a civil rights section of the Justice Department, along with a Commission on Civil Rights, to investigate discriminatory conditions. 3 years later, in 1960, Congress provided for court-appointed referees to help Black people register to vote. Both of these bills passed through Congress, but were viciously opposed and strongly watered down by Southern Democrats. In 1963, President Kennedy proposed the most extensive, sweeping civil rights legislation in history. But in November of that year, he was assassinated in Dallas, Texas. President Lyndon Johnson, who's actually from Texas, became president in his place, and he continued to push for legislation, facing fierce opposition from Southern Democrats all the way. But the Civil Rights Act of 1964 passed the House ultimately by a vote of 290 to 130 with bipartisan support. The bill then moved to the United States Senate, where Southern and border state Democrats staged a 75-day filibuster. A filibuster is where you endlessly speak in Congress, in this case in the Senate, preventing a bill from moving forward to a vote. It's amongst the longest filibuster in United States history. On one occasion, Senator Robert Byrd of West Virginia, who was a former Ku Klux Klan member, spoke for over 14 consecutive hours. But thanks to a large extent to President Johnson, and with the help of behind the scenes horse trading, the bill's supporters eventually obtained the 2/3 votes necessary for what's called cloture to end the filibuster. One of these votes actually came from a California senator named Claire Engel. He was too sick to speak, but signaled I in AYE, as in he wants to end the vote, by pointing at his eye. Having broken the filibuster, the Senate then easily passed the law and voted 73 to 27 in favor of the bill. Johnson, as you can see on the screen, signed it into law on July the 2nd, 1964. Under the Civil Rights Act of 1964, segregation on the grounds of race, religion, or national origin was banned at all public places of accommodation, including courthouses, parks, restaurants, theaters, sports arenas, and hotels. No longer was it legal for states or businesses or anything like that to deny Black people service simply based on the color of their skin. Next, I want to talk about Bloody Sunday, which is the march in Selma to Montgomery. There's a bridge, essentially. You can go see it today. That's where the march that you see on the screen is imaged right there. This is part of a series, actually, of civil rights protests that occurred in 1965 in Alabama. Alabama was one of the most Jim Crow entrenched states. In March of that year, so 1965, in an effort to register Black voters in the South, protesters marched 54 miles from Selma to the state capital of Montgomery, and they were confronted all the way with deadly violence from local authorities and white vigilante groups. As the world watched, the protesters, who were under the protection of federalized National Guard troops, finally achieved their goal. They walked around the clock for 3 days to reach Montgomery, Alabama. This historic march and Martin Luther King Jr.'s participation in it raised awareness about the difficulties that Black voters were facing. And as a result, the National Voting Act of 1965 was voted on and passed. This act preserved the rights of racial minorities to vote throughout the United States, particularly in the Jim Crow South, and was one of the most instrumental reasons why Black voter participation increased dramatically after 1965. One of the offshoots, however, of the passage of the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the National Voting Rights Act of 1965 was a fracture in the Democratic Party. Southern Democrats who had been staunch supporters of the Democratic Party felt betrayed by President Lyndon Blaine Johnson, who was a Democrat from Texas. And you see almost a dramatic shift of the South from Democratic control to Republican control between 1964 and 1968, when is the next election. There's other casualties, of course, as a result, and many of them are unnamed, but two of the most important that we have to keep in mind are two critical civil rights leaders. All the way back in February 21st, 1965, someone who I'll talk about more in greater detail later on, Malcolm X was assassinated in New York City. And then on April 4th, 1968, Martin Luther King Jr. was likewise felled by an assassin's bullet. Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968 is often dubbed as the end of the civil rights era.